Create a wheel-thrown jar. You first start by creating the jar form. This form can be any general shape and often follows the exact same steps as making a vase. The only difference is that when you get to the pulling stage, you need to consider the top lip and make sure it's thick enough so that it can transition for fitting a lid. In this demonstration, I open the depth and the width at the same time. Next, I'll approach the clay with a one-handed doming technique. This is allowing my left hand to do all the work of doming. Then I'll start pulling. The larger the form or the more the clay that you use, you often will use more fingers during the pulling step. With a smaller form, you might use only the middle and pointy finger. But in this case, this is about 3 pounds of clay, so you'll notice I use my ring finger behind the sponge during each pull. The reason for that is that more clay is moving from the bottom to the top than in a smaller pot, and you need the support of all those fingers. Now let's look at how to use some tools. Hold the wooden rib with 4 fingers on one side, the thumb on the other. Hold it in a straight up and down angle. Using the inside hand, push towards the edge of that rib tool and slowly move up the form. When you get to the top of the rib tool, you can move both hands at the same time. I call this setting up the cylinder. It straightens it out and also removes some of the wetness on the surface before I start shaping. Now I'm going to shape the form. To do this, I use the exact same hand formation as pulling, but I'm going to focus on a slight change in pressure between the outside and inside hands. So if I want the form to come outwards, I'm going to push a little bit harder with the inside hand, and you can see that happening now as I create a belly. I can create a reverse curve by pushing harder on the outside hand, and I generally move in the silhouette of a shape from bottom to top. Generally, I like to shape in multiple passes, so I'm not changing it too much at one time. In this case, I'm satisfied with the shape, so I'm going to move on to the metal rib tool. You can create an interior curve and hold it still on the outside edge, and similar to the wooden rib, just push slightly towards that edge. Make sure to frequently clear off any clay on the tool or it can stick to the form and pull it off center. Because the rib tool is flexible, you can create any form and hold it still on the outside. In this case, I chose a straight angle to the tool. I'll change the angle again one more time and work on the bottom, which is an exterior curve. Just make sure to have a light pressure from the inside hand, and you can smooth out not only the surface but also the shape. Like I mentioned earlier, the jar form is going to be very similar to what you do for making a vase. However, you do want to pay extra attention to the top lip. In this case, now that I've finished the form, I'm now going to put all my attention on making sure the top lip is thick enough and flat enough. You don't want your lid to sit on a crooked top, and you also need a ledge for that lid to fit on. So the first thing I'm going to do is needle tool the top. I hold the needle tool with a pencil grip and put my middle finger of my other hand on the inside. I'll push the tip towards that middle finger, and when it's all the way through, I'll lift up and remove that clay. To finish prepping the lip, I'm going to compress it by putting my thumb on the outside, middle finger on the inside, and my pointing finger of my other hand on top. Those 3 areas of contact force the clay to compress. Now I'm ready to create the ledge for the lid. This style of lid will require an interior ledge on the form, and it'll rest on that. So the first thing I do is I create a sloped lip. I'm going to use my thumb with a little bit of water on my thumb to press on that lip until it starts to round inwardly. I'm using 2 fingers on the opposite side to support that pressure. Just make sure you have enough water on the fingertips that you're using so it doesn't stick. Now I'm going to take that rounded lip and put an angle to it. So I'm going to use the fingernail of my pointy finger and push slowly downwards into that rounded lip, and it'll create an angle. With the corner of the wooden rib tool, I'm now going to make sure that ledge is straight and deep enough for a lid to fit. so a small pressure with the corner is all I needed. I'll then take my fingers and compress the new lip, which is now much thinner than it used to be. And I'm ready to finish any final touches on the form, so I'll go back to my rib tool and smooth anything out. Once you're satisfied with the form, you can now use the knife tool. I hold the knife tool underneath my hand in my palm. I put my pointing finger down the edge of the tool and support it with my left hand. I'll hold that tool at an angle and slowly push the tip until it reaches the bat. Once I've done that, I cut the ring of clay and get my tool underneath and turn it back on and remove that extra clay. Once you're finished with the jar form, you can now move towards the jar lid. In order to do that, you need to know how big to make your lid. In this case, I'll take a pair of calipers and I'll measure the distance between the lip of this form. I'll then take the calipers and set them aside so that I can use it later as a reference for my lid. I'm using far less clay for the lid, in this case just under a pound. I'll cone the form and then bring it down to a centered biscuit that's really low and flat. No need to open the form, so now we're ready to check the size and make sure that we have the correct width for the lid. I do this a couple times where I'll bring the calipers and put a little bit of pressure so I can see a line of how wide it should be. I can reduce the width a little bit by putting some pressure on the outside. Keep referencing that caliper. I try to make my lids slightly bigger than they need to be. That way I can easily trim down if I need to make it smaller. Now I'm going to create the knob of the lid. I'm going to use my thumb and the sponge behind it with some water to push clay towards the center. Be generous with the amount of water that you use to make sure nothing sticks. Once I've moved enough clay, I'm going to focus on the outer rim of this lid. And in doing that, I'm going to try and thin it out and flare it just a little bit. You can see that happening now. After I've flared and thinned out the lip, I'm now going to smooth things out with a rib tool. I'll take my metal rib and put it at an angle so that I can smooth out some of that base. Recheck the width. I want it to be just slightly bigger. In this case, it's too big, so I'm going to use a needle tool to bring it back down. Rethin out and flare the lip. Once things are smooth enough and the right size, you're ready to work on the shape of the knob. I try and consider the shape of the form and see if I can't somehow relate to that shaping, whether it's a curvature or a line. I'm going to start with a very generic knob shape and use my fingertips to start thinning out the neck of that knob. If things get too big, you can always needle tool and make it a little bit smaller. Just make sure that at all times you have a generous amount of water on your fingertips. Even just a small moment of dry pressure can create enough friction to pull that knob off. There is no defined technique for shaping a knob. However, I've learned that having multiple areas of contact is really helpful so that there's no one area taking on a lot of stress. So you'll notice I have fingers kind of all over the form to support it, but there's only pressure coming from one spot. I try and perfect the form with my fingertips, and as needed, I'll emphasize lines or smooth things out with the rib tool. Once you're done with the shaping and smoothing of the lid, you can use a knife tool to slightly cut into the bottom to save some time when you trim.